discussing the essay, The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe. This is a critique of the sort of 1950 to 1975 art scene in New York. Tom Wolfe is a social critic, and not critic in a sort of negative way. He's an observer, and he's written books about, particularly New York City. I think that was one of his fascinations, is New York's high society, New York's elites, and how they perceived themselves, how they perceived the world. Now, The Painted Word is a focus, a lens onto the art world of New York. And what he depicts here is the idea that modern art was created through theory, and that this idea that you see a painting or a piece of art is actually false. You don't perceive art, you think art. The painted word means that it's the word which actually creates the art. It's the theory and not the art itself. So the perception itself is not enough. You need to have an overlay, a theory. You need to, what you perceive as art happens in your brain. It does not happen through your visual sensors or your emotional sensors. It happens through your brain, and then it reflects everything else. Now, this has, in my opinion, massive implications, because this goes back to the theory of science. This goes to David Deutsch. Theory and observation. Observations are theory laden. This goes to Einstein, the conversation between Einstein and Heisenberg, where Einstein says, look, what we actually perceive is what starts with a theory. We need a theory in order to see. We can't just perceive. I want to read a passage from a conversation between Einstein and Heisenberg, just to illustrate how profound this is. This essay is much, much deeper than just an art critic of the sort of mid-20th century. Here is the excerpt from Werner Heisenberg's interview with Thomas Kuhn. Well, why not say that all the things which should be handled in theory are just those things which we also can hope to observe somehow? I remember that when I first saw Einstein, I had a talk with him about this. He said, that may be so, but still, it's the wrong principle in philosophy. And he explained that it's the theory, finally, which decides what can be observed and what cannot. And therefore, one cannot, before the theory, know what is observable and what not. So this is a lot more profound, what Tom Wolfe gets at in The Painted Word. What can be observed and what cannot be observed comes after the theory. This is the fundamental zeitgeist of the 20th century, started in the early 20th century with the birth of quantum mechanics and general relativity, and it's continuing. I'm going to elaborate on that, because this permeates not just art, it permeates business. Silicon Valley. I'm about to write an essay, The Spoken Dollar, which is an allegory to the painted word, in a sense that the same way that we have a cabal of theoreticians that decide what we see in the museum, we have a cabal of Silicon Valley venture capitalists that tell us what the future will look like by building a narrative around companies and startups. Whether those startups are successful or not, by the way, is not even that important. There are companies out there such as Uber and Airbnb and Beyond Meat, and you can go on, that Snowflake and many companies that really have a very difficult time justifying themselves in a sort of commercial, traditional way. But in theory, and in the theory of the cabal, which is, let's say Mark Andreessen and A16Z, and then from down there, this pyramid goes, Sequoia and whatnot, maybe even the Khosla Ventures at the bottom of this pyramid. They all have a say in defining who actually is going to be the unicorn, the company of the future. And Wall Street follows Le Monde, or Tout le Monde, as Tom Wolfe calls it. They follow the cabal. So this is very deep. Now, this is, on the one hand, a massive opportunity, but on the other hand, also a massive risk, because you have a very narrow cabal of people who decide what is and what isn't. And let's remember why we had this obsession with observation, with empirical study in the first place. We had it to get away from the cabal, which was the birth of the Enlightenment, Galileo, and then the Enlightenment that followed afterwards, where people actually were sick and tired of the church and the definition of what is and what isn't through the church. So they went to to the observation, and then in the sort of post-World War II area, with the birth of modern art, with the birth of quantum mechanics, with the birth of general relativity, we are now going back to an area where observation is theory laden, and where we cannot decide what we observe before we have a theory. This is a very thin line, very dangerous line, because we are at risk of falling into a cabal. And if you look at the political situation these days, you could say, yeah, I mean, we are, our freedoms are being curbed everywhere, and we are falling into this risk of a narrow elite telling us what is and what isn't. So this is on the one hand a huge opportunity, like David Deutsch would say. Imagination, human ingenuity has unlimited space here, and it's not defined by what we can see. It's defined by what we can think about, but then also the risk of what can that we have a very narrow cabal of people who decide, which is exactly what Tom Wolfe criticizes also in The Painted World. Now, I would say the synthesis of this, in my opinion, is that there is still a real world out there. And the real world, whether it's in the investment world or in physics, there is actually such a thing. You can do experiments, and even in art, you can say, okay, the painted word, like you perceive art through the word, but in the end, you still have to hang a picture. You have to hang it and enjoy it. And that's something that no theoretician can realistically impose on. Same with companies. That in the end there is a reality check, and I think we need to be conscious of that. This is not even a podcast. It's March 13, 2024. This is Krim Delco. For the day, we're down 3.5%. The market's down 0.5%. For the year, we're down 19%. The market is up 8%. We're underperforming by 27%. Discussing the essay, The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe. I think it's a massive, massive essay. I think it's one of those 2.5-hour reads. Nothing really quick and relatively concise, but every word, every sentence could be expanded into a book. So it's one of those pieces of literature. Tom Wolfe, of course, a massive, massive writer, not just in his eloquence and his techniques, but also in his intellect. So I want to talk about three things here. One is the idea of the painted word, the illustrated. Then I want to talk about the sort of the risk of that. Sort of the on the one hand, the idea is it's a great idea, and I think it's the zeitgeist which has been proliferating throughout the 20th century. And since we are now in the 21st century, I think the question is legitimate: what comes next? And I think what comes next is crypto. There is a point to be made for crypto, in a sense that we have to get away from the cabal. And crypto has, at least fundamentally, in principle, the chance to become the decision maker of what is and what isn't. I'm going to elaborate on that. So first, what is the painted word? The idea of the painted word, the essay itself is a critique of the New York art scene post-World War II. It's a description of art history, in a historic way, meaning not the description of paintings, but more like this happened, and that happened, and there was this and that, and so on and so forth. And the fundamental idea is that after sort of in the World War I, post, Picasso, Impressionist type area, what started was that art critics started theorizing about art, and art became a sort of second derivative of the theory. In other words, as the artists were considered illustrators of the word was really what the art was. The theory decided what we see. The theory decided how we perceive art. This is the birth of modern art. So whether it's Picasso or later on de Kooning and Jasper Johns and then Warhol, and you can go on. Of course, this stops in 75. So we have a whole other area of art history that came afterward, but we could even throw in there performance art. And now today things are a little different, and that's okay. It's supposed to be like that. Of course, times change. I'm going to talk about today in sort of the synthesis. But in general, what Tom Wolfe is describing here is the idea that what we see is theory laden, that it's the theory that tells us what we see. And that's the premise. Now, there's a little bit of irony, and there's a little bit of skepticism and cynicism and all kinds of things like that that come with this idea. For example, certain art critics, I mean, he calls it sort of the Kulturberg manifesto. I think it's definitely also a bit of a snidey remark towards the Jewish cabal, which was taking over media, culture, Hollywood. That was still acceptable in the 70s. Today, I guess he would have a harder time, and I'm not surprised you don't hear much about Tom Wolfe in these days, because I guess he's not woke-proof. He would not be, the drill masters of today would not accept him. The cabal or the decision makers of what culture is and what isn't just wouldn't agree with him. He's also criticizing the 1930s, by the way, with social realism and the drill masters and the propaganda in those years. A critique of socially and politically motivated culture, which of course today is prevalent. So I could see why Tom Wolfe today is not being considered anymore as sort of, woke proof, but nevertheless, intellectually and for the history of American literature, he's a massive, massive writer. And I think what I want to discuss here is really the point that what we see is theory laden. This is so important because it permeates to science. This is exactly what Einstein says in this conversation with Heisenberg. It is the theory which decides what is observable. Now, this has a massive, massive upside. The upside is that means that we have an infinite amount of possibilities to observe the world, because the theory is in abstract space. So we can come up with ideas of how to perceive the world, and this is very well documented in the Painter Word. We had different perceptions of art, and then art became earth art, and then later on performance art, and art had to be in the moment. But these are all theoretical concepts which allow us and the art world to grow, which is great. What's the downside? There's this cabal of, he calls it about 10,000 people in the whole world. That was in the 1970s. They really decide what is art. That's a risk. That's not good. And now if we extrapolate this to the sciences and to business, that same risk is there. So what do I mean with extrapolating science and business? I already mentioned that the sciences, particularly in the wake of Einstein, had that same cultural manifesto, which is what theory decides what we observe. And the same now applies to even business. Silicon Valley is drenched in theory-laden observations. In other words, companies are formed, created, and they go public, and they very often defy any kind of common sense. There is no economic value in a lot of these companies, whether it's Uber, Airbnb, whether it's WeWork, and the list goes on. It doesn't matter. Some of them collapse, but that's often an unforced error, too much greed, too much stupidity, or whatever. And most of them are still around. Like Uber has no economic value in a sense that it can generate a sustainable amount of free cash flow. It just doesn't. And it also doesn't have the value in a sort of maybe Golden Gate Bridgian type of way where you can say, let's say, those are the kinds of value creation mechanisms that made Amazon a rational investment, because you can say, look, you're not making money, but you're building this massive, massive infrastructure, which is valuable. You could say the same thing about Tesla. Now with Uber, of course, you can always say, well, they're also building an infrastructure. Well, what is the infrastructure? It's sort of this scheduling rides, but that's a tricky one, because you have Google Maps, you have Apple Maps. They already have, you have the applications in GPS. You have other map services. So that problem has been solved. Estimated time of arrival has been solved. So then the coordination, okay, fine, there's probably some value there, but you can see like they're already theorizing now, because the actual Uber makes more money if they don't. Uber is more profitable if they don't operate. In other words, if they operate, they lose money. Now they can, you can also argue there's maybe predatory capitalism at work here. So all they're going to do is, push everybody out, and then do the same service like there was before the taxi. If you think about it, let's say, I'm sorry, this is not meant to be picking on Uber, but it's just a very good example. And I just recently had a conversation with somebody about this company, and they got very angry at me. And I could see like, why is somebody angry at me when I talk about investments? Shouldn't investments be an objective, down-to-earth, business-type conversation? It shows you that if there's anger and emotions in there, that means that it's theory laden. The same way you shouldn't really be angry about talking about art. You look at art, you either like it or not. And you shouldn't be angry about theory and physics. But even in physics, there is theory, there is the interpretation, for example, interpretation of quantum physics, which people like, Everett, for example, he killed himself because he wasn't accepted by the establishment, because what you see is defined by theory. So there's this idea of observation of theory laden permeates throughout all of culture. It's the one fingerprint of the 20th century that comes with amazing upside. The 20th century has seen the biggest accumulation of wealth, technologies, innovation in human history, and it comes with huge downside, which is that you have these cabals, whether it's in the art world, whether it's in economics, in business, or in science, that hijack these fields and make them their own, and then cause harm, or in a milder way, just deter further progress. So there's this downside. The downside, again, this is also depicted, this is also shown in the Paint the Word. Tom Wolfe talks about the risk of having a very narrow amount of people deciding what is and what isn't. So that is a risk. And I think the way we can mitigate that risk is, now this is the synthesis of this this talk, because the risk is in science, the risk is in business, the risk is in the art world, right? The risk that we have a very narrow amount of people. Take Silicon Valley, for example. I'm going to write this essay, something along the lines that the working title is the spoken dollar, which is that we have these cabals starting with A16Z, which is currently on top of the heap, and they, through their word, their theory, decide what is and what isn't. They decide what is acceptable, what is desirable, what are unicorn companies, and they have a lot of power by being in that position. They they manage, or they, well, maybe not manage, but they influence the popular culture, the media. It's desirable to work for a company like Uber, regardless of whether there is economic value or not. And when you have a company that doesn't sustainably create economic value, you have a lot of other bad things happening in there. But this is now beyond this essay. But you have, virtue signaling. You have, power-hungry managers who gain power over maybe more useful people, and then you have this negative selectivity. You have people wasting their careers. So there's a lot of what we need some sort of reality check. I guess this would be my synthesis. And we don't have to give up the idea of the cabal, or we don't have to give up the idea that observations are theory laden. That is not a bad idea in itself, because it opens up opportunities. But we need to find a better way to decide who is in the position to decide what is and what isn't. That's what we need to work on, and that's where I think crypto could come in, or cryptographic ideas. I mean with cryptographic ideas, I just mean what crypto has done is it solved the Byzantine generals' problem. So how can we have a decentralized decision-making process that proliferates information and makes sure that when information originates at A, it ends up at B at the right in the right way, and it is what it's meant to be. And we also found a way to make it, decide what is and what isn't. Whether it's validating Bitcoin or whether it's validating NFTs or whatever it may be. I think crypto has some interesting solutions in terms of societal decision making. And as far as I'm concerned, I think the most important thing from my perspective, now this is my idea of how to solve this cabal issue, would be to have a system in place. And this is the original idea of democracy, which is simply we can replace existing ideas with better ideas. And that without violence. That's the fundamental idea. That's the goal. Whether that can happen in a crypto way or in a voting way or whatever way that happens, that's not so crucial to me. What's really important is that we find ways to replace art with better art, companies with better companies, science with better science. Now, you might say, okay, what's better? Well, better for me personally is what makes me better off. So that's my first set of priority. But what makes me better off has to be sustainable within society. So I can't ask for, just all resources being devoted to me. Of course, that just doesn't work like that. So I'm very utilitarian when it comes to that. I'm happy to share as long as what I give up is worth giving up for the better good and not just for the good of somebody else. I despise corruption. I despise hypocrisy. I think, for example, people that are supposedly left-wing liberals who send their kids to private schools and live in million-dollar homes, they're not genuine about improving society. So they are not in the business of making a better society. They are just in the business of making a socialist society, except, of course, themselves. For themselves, it's rugged individualism, but for everybody else, it's socialism. So that's kind of where I stand when it comes to this decision making. So again, I think to summarize, in the painted word, Tom Wolfe really hits the nail on the head here when it comes to what the 20th century actually became, which is it became a century of theory, laden, observation. That's really what it is. So the painted word is the spoken dollar, it's the spoken formula, it's whatever you want to use this metaphor for, science, business, politics. It's ideas that matter, and that's a good thing. That's also what David Deutsch says. I think if we put ideas at the forefront of progress, we have better. We have a lot more optionality, right? Ideas are, I don't know if it's infinite, but there's a lot more opportunity to observe the world if what we observe depends on our theories. we can develop new instruments or new theories or both to see things differently. For example, we can develop a lithium-ion battery and then perceive lithium as a scarce resource. We can develop massive GPU technology for AI and then perceive electrons as shortage, or power usage of chips all of a sudden become something that we need to optimize for. So our theory depends on, our technology depends on our theory, and the technology then drives observation. So it's a reciprocal process, it's a flywheel. It can also backfire, and it backfires if we have a cabal of people who decide and don't let other people decide. This is what happened. This is what monotheistic cultures do. This is what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have done for thousands of years, which is create ideas based on books or narratives and proliferate those ideas and decide what we see and what we observe based on those ideas. So that's fundamentally what, definitely it's a heritage of monotheistic cultures, in particular Christianity. What we don't want is an inquisition. And I'm not sure whether Tom Wolfe is on board with the concept of inquisition. He's certainly very critical of a narrow cabal of people deciding what art is and what is good art and what is, all of those things. He's definitely against that. So that's established. But he doesn't offer solutions. My solution is a Popperian approach towards decision making, which is, how about we replace something with better? How about we do that? How do we do that? We could use cryptographic technology. We could use Byzantine General's problem solution type technology to maybe have better decision making. But more practically, of course, we are let's apply this to Silicon Valley. What's going on in Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley supposedly is a very competitive place. Well, is it? Why are so many companies coming out of Silicon Valley that are not sustainably profitable? That is a signal that we have this cabal of chosen people who decide what is and what isn't. And they decide. It's not based on natural selection or natural metrics that nature imposes on us, such as, for example, you have to sustainably create resources for yourself to survive. You can't piggyback on other people's resources. Look at Uber. Uber has for over a decade now consumed resources in the name of some sort of imaginary value that the cabal decides. You can keep adding, just a few companies out there, Snowflake, we have companies like Moderna that supposedly have a great technology. Then it requires a massive social and political coercion to have the people buy their product. So where are they now? Why aren't they successful in delivering value to society? Subsidies don't work. Look at the Soviet Union, look at China. Subsidies don't work. Whether you subsidize through investors, whether Mark Andreessen, who's the Andy Warhol of Silicon Valley, whether he thinks that WeWork or the subsidiary or the subsequent companies that these people are building are worth investing, it doesn't matter. You can't subsidize forever. In the end, at some point, the rubber will meet the road. The rubber will meet the road in the sense that we need to create some value, in the sense that we have to create more resources than we're wasting. Take the oil industry, take nuclear power. Those are not good technologies because they require a lot more resources than they produce. In the case of oil, of course, we're talking about geopolitical resources, wars, things along those lines. It's too expensive. We need to find better solutions. And that is where the proliferation of ideas and the proliferation of freedom of ideas is crucial. Thank you.